Okay, thanks for joining us today. We do have a packed agenda, so I'm gonna get started on time over here. Hey everyone, so before we dive into the content, I just wanted to set some expectations and goals and takeaways. There's probably a group here that has some Ethereum fanboys like myself, and maybe another group of innovation leads just looking to put blockchain on their portfolio, kind of like the younger version of me that used to work at a bank. And by the end of the presentation, both groups hopefully will be able to have these same key takeaways. Number 1, institutions are pursuing enterprise-grade ethereal implications, and they have been for the past 3 years. Also, the Imperium infrastructure and tools are much more mature than they used to be, so if you've been taking a hiatus and looking at other platforms, it's probably a good idea to come back to Ethereum and take a look. And finally, the enterprise requirements of permission, privacy, performance, finality are being addressed in different flavors, and today we'll go through a lot of those use cases of how it's being addressed. Okay, so this is today's journey. I will give a short overview of blockchain and the Ethereum, then we'll jump into the enterprise Ethereum requirements. From there, Jeff will go through 3 different use cases that match public, private, and consortium-based enterprise criteria, and then from there I'll end with a bit of a product pitch around some different builds that we've been doing with consensus and different resources that are available today. First, you have myself. Who am I? My name is Clemens1. I'm a solution architect. I spent 2.5 years at R3 helping build out quarter-and-quarter design use cases. I recently came back to Ethereum as it was my first love a few months ago, but before that I worked at Credit Suisse where I built trading systems, and I started the blockchain working group there as well. So with me presenting is Jeff, so I'll let him introduce himself. Everybody, Jeff Gillis. I used to work in product and marketing at Google Analytics, and now do the same here at Consensus. I told Clemens that I love dancing and confidence, but I also wanted to tell all of you as well. I kind of so great to be here. Thanks. Okay, so first, who's Consensus? Consensus was founded by Joseph Lubin, who had the mission to build the top of stack applications and products necessary for fostering the Ethereum ecosystem. So if you look at all of these different icons 3 years later, you probably can't build Ethereum without using one of these Consensus products. You'll see here some major ones like Infire and Truffle MetaMask, which are core to the developer toolbox. Most of this is just to make the dev and DevOps experience much better. We've also contributed to the Ethereum Enterprise, if you're Million CEA, as well as Kaleido, Pegasus, Pantheon, Ethereum 2.0, and a lot of these will pull through. And in the rest of the presentation, other notable products like Alessio, which does a full blockchain explorer, also for enterprise, as well as Balance, which does the IRS compliance. So make sure to pay your taxes because that's pretty important as well. Okay, so if you've been in any of these consulting workshops, which I've sat in and hosted quite too, Workmaster a few, you'd probably seen this, the standard police cliche page. If you haven't, congratulations, there's probably some of you left, but essentially it starts off with saying Bitcoin as an experiment combines a lot of existing technologies, and you might hear blockchain is the underlying technology of Bitcoin. So we're all happy with the experiment, but where we're using the core architectural principles of blockchain, and so in most consulting companies they kind of do the same thing. It's a data structure, and actually most of the time if you talk to Microsoft or Accenture or Deloitte, they actually try to convince people not to use blockchain for those use cases and say just use a shared database or use the private database. My opinion is we all do love Bitcoin and the Ethereum, and I feel like it was an experiment that was successful specifically for self-sovereign and programmable trusts, which I'll talk about the next few slides. So why not just a shared database? The problem is around what programmable trust solves for, which is who actually owns the data. Without institutions running and controlling all of these different pieces, we've actually opened up the idea of decentralization and then stayed true to the core of blockchain. So it's not just creating a shared database, but creating that full ecosystem. The promise here. So what is the architectural database principles behind blockchain? It is around the front loading of a lot of the governance and adoption, hoping that these new standards will be globally adopted. But if you look at all these core 3 Workmaster pieces, the consulting companies will probably pitch something very similar. Both ledger immutability, it's a write-once database that records transactions. It uses self-referencing hashes for rural trees. There's permission specifically for cryptographic hashes, right? So that the same private public keys that have existed with no BitTorrent and in Merkle trees that are from the Napster and BitTorrent days as well. Smart contracts, you could just think of that as data storage plus business logic, key value pairs, and really decentralization, which is the core here. That there's a lot of replications of the database so that you can guarantee trust across the versions of the data. We going through this. If you just wanted to summarize it and you had an elevator pitch from the enterprise side, you could just read this deck. This says that blockchain provides the native certainty and a network even amongst untrusted parties without the need for an intermediary, and decentralization is key to this. Okay, so people say blockchain disrupts everything. The truth is that the past 3 years people have been convincing others not to use blockchain for the enterprise space, but I would say in the public space you'll see a lot of these case studies really do have massive social impact and financial inclusion possibilities. I personally see this as the next version of open banking and really lowers the barrier of entry for developers to access your real money transfer without the large banking fees. Now for now, the pitches that I've seen really replaces a lot of manual reconciliation and a lot of heavy paper-based formats for Workmaster in the enterprise space. Now hopefully in the near future you'll see a lot of overlaps of these industries, so I'm really looking forward to smart cities and smart governments that remove those legacy system frictions and manual human intervention so that you can really foster and use the technology for what it was for. So this is generally just for blockchain and its possibilities. This next slide is specifically about Ethereum and kind of the Ethereum-based implementation. So I think Ethereum stays magical because it stays true to the blockchain ideal. The transactions are still being processed in the consistent way, and adding in smart contracts you can do a lot of clever things with processing the changes to the smart contract state. And today obviously in the public space you have quite a bit of smart contracts running multi-billion dollars worth of Cryptocurrency markets, you may be not fully billions, but if you take into account the 90% of other ERC-20 tokens, it might still get up there, and it is still a single version of truth for this ledger, so it's not split into different states or state channels in any way, okay? And the fact is, Ethereum has the largest and most proven ecosystem in the world. It is live with all these digital assets, and it does position you well to explore it because you can benefit from all the development and experience that has been coming around from this space. These are just some stats for the public network. The battle-testedness make a big difference. There's quite a few downloads of truffle and continuous growth for developers. We do have Consensus Academy as well, I think 5. Workmaster. A lot of different companies have built their own little mini Ethereum hackathons plus Ethereum bootstrapping different services, and I would say that over the past 3 years it's really grown quite impressively, and hopefully the use cases we described today will prove that. So with that, let's ground this with an example. I'm gonna hand it back to Jeff, which will talk about buying a house. Great, thanks Clemens. So here's an example of Ethereum. This is a public app which we'll go through, but shows the power of the platform and creating efficiency and opportunity. We've had a couple requests for the slides. We will make those available afterwards, and we'll also get into some real-world use cases as requested, which you'll see in just a sec. So buying a home, here are all the documents needed to go through the process, from the driver's license to a financing application form and employment letter, pay slips to bank account state, even some more. I mean, just tons of documents. Many of them need to be notarized, and there's the documents as you go through the process. Can you imagine doing this twice in a short amount of time, or even 3 times? What if you lose something or stop working with a certain broker and move on to another one? It's slow. These are the pain points. It's very manual. The consumer has to visit multiple entities. There's a huge reliance on paper documentation, back office processing, drag. Then also it's just very manual, and it can be very expensive as well. As you go through the life cycle, there's not much transparency either. So what if all of this was put on as self-sovereign, which means you own 6 Workmaster, the access to your data, which if we were put on a blockchain, what if we're all securely stored and it allowed you identity control? And perhaps this blockchain is nothing more than a repository to make real estate purchases more efficient. Is it worth the setup? Let's take a look. So here, bank buyer and seller are all able to confidently access information in a blockchain. By the way, these systems have been tested to be more secure than centralized banking servers. Throughout the process of blockchain could be a one-stop shop for storing the documents and verifying that a step has been completed. For example, the buyer could immediately establish suitability to purchase by storing all their documents in a blockchain accessible by both the buyer and the broker. Then the buyer has more flexibility and credibility. They can work with any seller or broker that they want, and it's easier for more serious buyers to approach the seller because their records are ready. Then once a buyer and seller agree with some intent to buy, sales or purchase agreements, they can all be also stored as well in one place for easy access, including for a bank. The seller could potentially also store the deed or title of the house in the blockchain, which you can see a little further down in the life cycle. If there are any inspections that have been completed, they can all be also stored on the blockchain, making all this verifiable and immutable. Zooming out, there are other participants in each phase of the life cycle of a property, such as planning or land, apartment or construction developers. If these had transparency and 7 Workmaster ease of access to this asset information, it could also make this market have much less friction. So for example, authorities like a clerk in a courthouse, when you file the title, or where the land department could issue the title right on the blockchain, make it easier for transfer, as well as not losing it. This could also show all modifications to the house, as well as blueprints, as well as previous owners in case they need to be contacted. And you can start to extrapolate out what if the blockchain can be linked to from other government registries like wills or trusts and estates, and if the owner perhaps passes away or something like that, it's listed right there, and transfer ownership becomes a lot easier and safer and quicker. So you can start to see the multi-sided markets being created. Let's talk about a real-world example. This in production, so a lot of what I just talked about isn't possible quite yet. It requires a ton of coordination with banks and governments, but it's not far away, and there's currently an app that applies this blockchain vision to real estate. It creates new marketplaces by tokenizing real estate, so it allows you to fractionalize ownership of a property. It's a BBC product. It's already out on the mainnet. It's called Meridian. Meridian converts individual properties into digital shares on the blockchain, connecting investors and asset owners. So say I have $1,000. I'd like to invest to diversify my portfolio on something other than stocks, but I can't buy real estate with only $1,000. It's just not enough money. So what if 8 Workmaster, a property owner of an apartment building on the other side, wants to unlock $2 million of investment in that property? They've got it all sitting there waiting for this large liquidation event that can take a year or more to occur, but perhaps they don't want to sell the whole thing. Meridia makes it possible for the owner to sell shares in the building and for a buyer to just own a small part of it, however much is agreed upon, and there can be multiple buyers that can participate. The values represented in tokens purchased through a website built on the Ethereum blockchain Meridia, and investors reap a proportionate amount of rent until it can become as well. So there's other value that can happen throughout, and if the building obviously grows in value, so did the shares. The owner could always buy back the shares as well, and they don't have to wait for that large liquidity event. Perhaps they want to do some repairs to the house. They need some capital right away. They can use this to do that. Here's what it looks like. It takes advantage of the Ethereum smart contracts to represent what we call a non-fungible token, which means it's just one big asset and further offers fractional ownership of real estate without using a number of middlemen and who just skim off this $100 billion market. There's their properties already live on radio. For instance, 304 Troutman Street in Brooklyn, which is a multi-family residence. Can you imagine having a property in Hawaii that I might like to invest in, or a hotel somewhere in Europe? Putting in a little bit of money and watching you grow in addition to whatever other savings. 9 Workmaster that you have. So this slide on the left, you can see a description of the asset. It's a stabilized 5-unit multifamily home in Brooklyn. You can see that the asset is held in a legal corporate structure, so a lot of work has gone into creating this in a legal way. This investment class, and then the tokenization is done on Meridia, where the shares and the property are digitized. Investors are vetted, and then the key achievement I think isn't the first one on the right. There greater liquidity for investors to recapitalize the property with other people. Great. And then you also have some other things that you couldn't have had in the existing real estate market, like real-time asset valuation as decided on by a market. Great. Okay, so video is great, and we love it that there's a lot of original DAP ideas that are geared towards retail and the C and customer-facing applications. But what about B2B? And what if you wanted to build something with these trusted institutions and take advantage of that shared ledger nature? What if this network needs to scale for faster transaction throughput? What if you need to adhere to different regulations around privacy? Or what if the pseudonymity as a feature should not be a feature? So there are some kick aspects. So this section we're gonna go through the emergence of Enterprise Ethereum and how it's being implemented. So experimentation with Enterprise grade Ethereum started as early as 2016. I was doing it back in 2015 from the Credit Suisse days when I first came out, but when I joined R3 in February of 2016 before Corte, most of the banks were actually experimenting with the Ethereum in I0. Workmaster parallel, you have JP Morgan that forked Ethereum death and added privacy layers with a Constellation smart contracts as well as with their coordination of separate nodes for privacy. And then you have in 2017 the emergence of Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, which was aimed for driving standards and specifications by 2018 that grew to over 400 members for Kaleido. This was in late 2017. We had a team of XIV members join Consensus and built out this product idea. They launched in May with AWS and have over 1200 Ethereum nodes running in private networks right now. Working with our Consensus Solutions team to do tests on these separate Ethereum nodes. Pegasus is a protocol engineering team was founded in May of 2017, and they've been working on Pantheon, which I'll go into more detail to in the following slides to them for the past year and a half. They've just released it at DEF CON 3 for a mainnet client. So when do you want to use public versus permission that works? Ultimately, it does depend on the use case. The public network gives the power back to the individual, like we mentioned, the self-sovereign openness with the risk and reward of managing your own keys and also using different wallet services. You can pick the ones that you'd like to use for sending those transactions. The public mainnet also has the initial token economic incentives, and I would say it's more secure because of the number of global validator nodes. Why would you want to go permissioned? So permissioned assumes there is still a level of trust, institutional trust, for the parties that run the network, and there's likely some network governance too. Workmaster documents underlying and underpinning all of this that agrees to their own terms of service of hosting, of adding, managing, and then kind of adding new members to the network. Now, once you remove some of the public trust elements, you can add layers of privacy, new consensus mechanisms for finality like IB fee, and improvements on scalability and throughput. The reason why we're recommending Ethereum for this in the private network sense is really the consistency of the stack and allowing for bridging back to mainnet, and we think that is probably a core principle. Once Ethereum 200 comes out, there may be certain use cases where you want it to exist on the mainnet space, specifically on the governance side. I think a good example of a private network, and this is a centrally owned by a single organization private network, is what if you have a bank's innovation or emerging technology group replace their intranet as a sandbox. So I've seen this in a few different use cases just working with different banks. They've basically driven internal community interests by giving developers their own Ethereum profiles and addresses and allowing them to eternally just spin up different hackathons and test different dApps. You can hook up your different systems. Internally there would be faucets. It's a good learning curve, but you can also link your identity, build out some leaderboard games. I think it's really good hands-on learning and really gives some power back to developers within a bank in terms of consortium-based governance. There's tons of these networks out there. I think the value here is 12. Workmaster really when you have an end-to-end across multiple industries, because when you cross through industries you have a lot more CSV exports and translators that exist specifically maybe between SAP or other types of ERP systems. So maybe the first step that I've seen is, for example, like Project Jasper and Ubin and Coco, which we'll talk about later, is the domestic set of banks doing interbank payments with a central bank providing that regulation and doing some type of depository receipt on the central bank. Those particular certificates. A second step after that maybe could be central banks working together as a consortium communicating with foreign exchange rates and different assets and collateral across different jurisdictions. And then maybe later on you'll have insurance and banking work together with supply chain use cases or trade finance or global trade. These cases and some of those we will describe later as well, but there's kind of evolution of consortium-based governance associated to it. Okay, Ethereum clients, we just want to bring this up very briefly. The clients is written in different languages. You can have different features associated to it depending if you like Pascal versus Go versus Java versus C++. So all these are open to the developer, but they all connect to the same Ethereum protocol and synced appears to store the same transactional data. So we've seen a lot of Quorum implementation specifically for governance, security, and confidentiality, and it kind of stays close to the core code base. There are tweaks that are made to this and Pantheon in the next slide. 13. Workmaster C is really trying to add on the Java client different aspects of privacy to connect to the enterprise requirements. I know there are a lot of questions. I think we're going to answer them at the end. Bear with us. So for Pegasus and Pantheon, Pegasus starting in May of 2017 has grown to a 50-person team. It has a research arm dedicated to sharding privacy sidechains, other types of the Ethereum 2.0 pieces, and it's contributing heavily to that effort, plus the EA spec writing effort. It's currently on mainnet. They released at DEF CON. They will have a private and permission version in early 2019, and beyond that they're adding, and I believe too, was and other peer-to-peer libraries. We have some representatives from Pegasus here as well. well, if we have time at the end we can let them dive deeper. So I mean ultimately just to drive this enterprise section home, we're certainly bullish that these private and consortium networks can anchor back to mainnet at some point specifically for global verification, and we'll talk about open law in a second, but I mean I personally believe that open law is impactful just to have the proof legal documents and in-depth verification. So, what we're really looking forward to connecting it back to kind of this stateful internet rather than just a bunch of private networks. Okay, I'm going to pass back to Jeff, which has 2 more grounding use cases for the information that I just provided. Great, thanks Clement. So let's give an example of a kind of sensitive private network. This is a private chain. This is a 75,000 person Syrian refugee camp in Jordan, middle of 14. Workmaster nowhere 6 miles from the Syrian border. It's become a makeshift home for people fleeing Syria. These people have no government identity documents or a bank account. They just had to run. Can you imagine not going through life with anything that can identify you? We chose this example just to take a step back and kind of let you get your juices flowing to see what's possible. This webinar is around just kind of conceiving what's possible with enterprise versions of the scenario, so this one kind of just touches a lot of interesting sensitive points and thought might be some good inspiration. So here is a supermarket in this camp, which the camp serves. The supermarket serves about 75,000 refugees. The World Food Program, the WFP, is a humanitarian organization, and they're the ones who are the subject of this case study. Implemented a private Ethereum blockchain. I know there's been some questions around private versus permission versions of blockchain, so this one might answer some. So the WFP helps fill a feed 80 million people around the globe, but since 2009 the organization shifted their business model from delivering food to transferring money to people who need the food instead. They did this to save money. It's obviously less expensive than shipping to ship money than food, and the approach also gives money to people, improving local economies to people serving the food, and also increasing transparency for the WFP itself. But it introduces a very notable point of efficiency, which I think a lot of fans of blockchain will understand. That was the inefficiency was in working with local or regional 15 workmaster banks. So the WFP would transfer money to the banks, which would then process the money and make it available to the refugee, but the banks charge transaction fees, and it also would take days or weeks to process the transactions to get the money to the refugee. There was also some risk involved in how they would process for the WFP, which transferred over $8 billion in such benefits in 2017. Transfer, transaction, and other fees of the money were things that could have gone into millions of meals, so that money they lost in fees could have resulted in millions more meals. Now instead it all works on an Assyrian blockchain, and this is again just some inspiration. So here's how it works in the supermarket. Refugees don't pay with cash or credit. They're identified through a retina scan, which confirms identity on a traditional UN database that's not related to blockchain, but it is a great technology. The identity is then used to query an account kept on a permission implementation of the Ethereum blockchain that's maintained by the World Food Program. The account is once the identity is validated, the account is given money, or the money that's in the account of this particular refugee is used immediately to pay the bill at the supermarket. So you know how much money has been used, you know who has used it, and how much they have left, and person themselves knows as well. So these people are settling their grocery bills without opening, while money is transferred to from the account to the supermarket, all done on the blockchain. Really efficient. But how efficient? Well, early results 16. Workmaster of the blockchain program have touted a 98% reduction in the fees that we talked about before, those transaction fees 98%, and the cash for food aid on the blockchain program has helped over 100,000 Syrian refugees in Jordan, and by the end of this year it will cover all 500,000 refugees in Jordan from Syria. So the program does 5 things. It reduces cost, time, and risk, but here's how. Number 1, it legally skips the intermediaries, in this case the banks. Number 2, there's no paperwork. Number 3, identity validation is instantaneous, accurate, and secure. Number 4, there are no little things like physical cards or paperwork that can wear out and need a new kind of credit card strip. And number 5, it reduces the risks of sharing refugees' data with local banks or officials or supermarket employees. Certain entities have been known to steal or commit fraud. At the same time, it improves the WFP. It gives them better control, better flexibility, and better accountability. They can control how their budget is spent very quickly, change very quickly. They can adapt to different needs, and they have accountable record of it all. Here's a quote from the WFP organizer of the blockchain in the refugee camp. Quote, "Now if we get a call that 20,000 people are coming in the night, we can have everything ready for them by the morning. In the old way, it would have taken 2 weeks and required paper vouchers, so it's causing a lot more efficiency." Great. Oh, I just had one more comment on this. Another benefit of this is that if this system had existed before refugees had to flee their kind of destroyed towns, they might 17 workmaster who have been able to avoid a refugee camp altogether and become a productive member of society right away in Jordan or somewhere in Europe. If Syria had revoked a passport or the school had been destroying what they had to agree, this immutable registry of their history follows them, and so it would be accessible wherever they do end up. And remember, this is a private permission versus another Ethereum. It does not connect to public Ethereum at all, in which is important because it's run by one company. And just some people think that everything has to go through the public network, but this is just inspiration to understand the benefits. So now we'll extrapolate some business use cases, and I'll show some as well. Here's another example. So this is that one was a private example run by one entity. The blockchain run by one entity. This is a consortium example, which is even more powerful in terms of optimizing a business process. And so this is the example. Interbank Payments. If I wire Clemming some money, we have different bank accounts. That money isn't put in a van and obviously driven over. It's digitally transferred between our 2 banks. It doesn't clear right away because the banks need to establish trust with each other. They have accounts in each other, just like I have an account. Another bank has an account with a different bank. Obviously, there could be thousands or millions of these transfers happening each day, so the banks have to keep a ledger with their accounts with each other. So what happens at the end of the day is if Purple Bank says Blue Bank owes them a different amount than Blue 18 Workmaster Bank shows on their ledger it can get really messy, and banks aren't just keeping money aside to settle these transfers. There this money is active or just being stored. It's not just waiting in order to settle up. So in many countries for security, there are central banks which simply act as accountants and third-party verification for these interbank transfers. These are called reserve banks or central banks. There's one in South Africa which we're going to talk about. They do real-time gross settlement or deferred net settlement. They have these systems where they keep a running ledger for all the participating banks, and maybe they settled once at the end of the day. They're responsible for making sure everyone's on the same page and that the money comes through them and goes to the right place. So here's the example. It's with the South African Reserve Bank, the SARB, and the question was how can central banks increase the resiliency of interbank payment systems while maintaining or reducing the overall cost of those systems? You can probably imagine it can get a little inefficient, and it can be pretty scary in case there is some kind of mistake. So can we use Web 3.0 to improve this at all? And blockchain. So here's the approach. The folks involved were the SARB as well as 7 banks apps as standard. You can read the rest there. This was called Project Coca. You can Google it. It's been written about. A company named Apara is the one that facilitated this and are still facilitating it, exploring the use of distributed ledger technology for interbank payment settlements in South Africa at 19. Workmaster started off as a simulation and it is now so successful it's moving into production. Clemens, did you want to talk about this slide? Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned at Hara, this is just a high-level infrastructure and how it's set up. The technical deployment aspects you can see there's on-premise installations as well as Azure and AWS public cloud as well as private assured cloud installations. You see all these little laptop-looking icons. These represent the different virtual machines running Ethereum nodes, and Consensus here is running a few nodes specifically for monitoring, and I believe within the requirements they also had a master view so that there is a master view that's able to view all the transactions. They use Pedersen commitment specifically for masking and obfuscating different parties. The great thing about Coca wasn't just repeating Rubin, but it was specifically to test out the scalability. So a lot of the tests that were done, and I think Jeff will bring up the numbers a little bit later, but it is to test the throughput and to test the scalability and propagation of the network. At Hara is more generic. The focus is on fiat-to-fiat transfers, but here they're using the same technology for a tokenizer and detokenizer of the sub-central plain funds. Great. So here's the value add that came out, just to restate what Clemens was just saying. So the early implementation was for testing purposes only, and Quorum provided an enormous efficiency boost for the system. Operational finality of the transaction was achieved by a consensus protocol called IBFT, which you can customize consensus on 20. Workmaster Enterprise Ethereum implementation. So it's not proof of work, not proof of stake, and it's not possible to revoke transactions once they were in the ledger. In Project Coca, it brought a higher degree of resilience, so each node also acted as a backup for the entire ledger, and then the messages were processed at sufficient scale like Clemens was saying, and in line with the current system processing times. Just 2 more points here. Confidentiality and privacy of transactions was maintained using more advanced privacy techniques than you'll find currently on Ethereum and Equid, but they are coming by the way, and visibility of the system for SARB was sufficient for regulations, for national South African regulations for oversight and operational management. So this right on the right of this slide you can see that 70,000 transactions in less than 2 hours. Tree achieved the performance target, and then they had 95% of block propagation time in under a second, and some more things right there. And then privacy was a big point Combs was mentioning, so it achieved privacy. Wild meetings require transaction volumes using things like Pedersen commits and some other advanced techniques. Great. So I'll cover this last section hopefully in 10 minutes. It's going to go through some of Consensus's approach to enterprise implementations, and as mentioned earlier, a lot of those use cases were retail and consumer facing. There was a lot of graduation from these incubated ideas into the full teams of startups that there are today, and the solutions are specifically. So I'm a part of Consensus Solutions is a little bit 21. Workmaster Younger, we're building a lot of the support for enterprise use cases, and we're really combining this for the enterprise world. So we're not exactly a separate consulting company, but we do a lot of advisory and delivery, and in the past year we've actually delivered quite a bit, 20+ enterprise projects across multiple industries, and we're still accelerating our development by using a lot of the lessons learned from the early days retail use cases from the Consensus products and ventures. So this is just a next slide, a snapshot of some of the companies that we've worked with, and yeah, it's been a fun ride. I mean, we've been working with these individually for either private networks to see how different businesses can take advantage of Ethereum, but also across Consortium. So we'll bring up Combo and a little bit as well. This is a high-level overview, and one of the jobs that I took on joining from the financial services arm is to map all of the different functional components of our different Consensus products into what looks like a separate digital asset market infrastructure. And then this was fun view, weeks just interviewing all these different groups, but it really breaks down. We have a blockchain and governance layer focusing on wallets, focusing on custodial services, security, key management. There are centralized and decentralized exchanges being built, a lot of underpinning pieces around legal and governance with open law. You have decentralized investment research with Helena, previously Frontier, different market and reference data. You have from G's Titanium Network, True 22. Workmaster set, and a lot of other things here that really fits in functionally to what investment banks and security trade banks use, right? That we've already talked about Muri 6, but we're working on a SO factory and other asset digital securities, so having real security tokens as well as the original ICO utility tokens done by Token Foundry, and these services are really being put together and treated as enterprise products. So there are some of these highlighted in green because I have more slides just diving into them. So we already spoke about Meridia, which has the same idea of fractional ownership of real estate can be applied to other types of assets, but let's dive into one of my favorite topics around open law. So I love open law as a product because it is one that that's live and anchors these legal documents and agreements with smart contract business logic, so it includes their legal markup language, embeds the smart contract code into the deployments. And why do you think it's important? It's because if you didn't need to contact a lawyer for executing or monitoring your contracts, you really have this as a living asset that can be reviewed. And also imagine if you know the movement of funds or payment of coupons for financial assets were also governed by these legal documents. You can really define a full asset lifecycle within the legal document and have that be reflected in the code as well. So they've been building this for over 2 years, and there's quite a few YouTube videos that they've been releasing probably once a week. These are actively ones that I personally like. The Employee-Employer 23 Work Master Payroll Agreement probably drove at home to me the most. So imagine if you've entered a legal agreement to be working for your employer. So this is an employee-employer contract for payroll, and this would automatically trigger your payments from the employer accounts, which could be a stable coin or some type of USDC or Tether or whatnot, and you could be paid at any variable time. So you don't have to wait every 2 weeks for payroll to come through. You can actually be paid by the second, the minute, the hour, or however the contract is written up. So in addition, I've also seen some more interesting ones. There's fractional ownership of Arch and tokenization of licenses. These are fully available. There's partnerships that are being done with financial assets and other standard bodies so that you can make this up and running for different standards like ISDA and ISDA. There's also arbitration involved here, so if you have to go into dispute resolution, any type of changes to the physical contract, so you can have private storage, document storage of these contracts if you change that. I believe the automatic contract, the smart contract suicides, and there's an export of data where you can use that for dispute resolution. So again, OpenLaw is up and running, and they've been very busy with a growing team, so feel free to reach out to them at OpenLaw.io and see some of the real stuff that they're putting through. The next one that I want to bring up as well with Kaleido. So Kaleido, I see it as infrastructure as a service that really simplifies DevOps for enterprise deployments, and a lot of the projects that we've been 24 Work Master working on internally would not have been done as quickly without this type of click-through tool, but also just taking care of the standard management and scalability that you would do for enterprise deployment. So on the left over here you have different organizations that are created. You can actually create a Kaleido account today on Kaleido.io and create a consortium and see the different types of products that you can install along with building out that consortium. So you would build an organization ID, add members, and live add new nodes for those members. There's an identity registry where the parent and sub-account mapping of those organizations and identities are placed into there. And also I wanted to bring up the Kaleido Marketplace, which was released at Web Summit, and this is really the deployment and continuous delivery of the DApp. So OpenLaw is a DApp that's available in the marketplace, so you can just spin out and deploy OpenLaw and those related DApps to your Kaleido consortium network. Another one to mention is Uport. So Uport is one of those older mature spokes or consensus products that's been around for a while. They have a full identity system now. You can go on and download the mobile wallet, connect it, and create your own now. Uport Wallet to explore. They have a full Viewport Connect, kind of like Facebook Connect or the Google Play Store type of connection with different identities, and yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's come a long way. They are currently live in production with Huge in Switzerland, providing the claims and identity protocol 25 Workmaster for their personal identities. The other one I want to mention is around Trustology. So this focuses on secure key management, and I think their quote is cold storage security with hot wallet speeds around 350 milliseconds, and that its first release will be form a net for individual usage for Bitcoin and Ether. But I think that the interest that it's grown, and it recently just raised $8 million from a venture of seed round. It will manage the key creation, transactions, loss, and recovery with experience with kind of this HSM backend as well. So a lot of parties from custodians are really interested in this for institutional investments. Okay, so we've covered key management, and just in general, if you wanted to work with Consensus, we have a diligence team that does full DApp diligence audits. So before you go to production, it's probably a good idea to go through security best practices. Now we do 3 to 6 week engagements to do full code assessments, and just follow the best practices so there aren't any public-based hacks. We work on this internally for our projects like Congo and I2I with Union Bank, but we've also done some public work as well. And then finally you have Consensus Academy. This is rather straightforward. You have in-person training programs, and you can find out more information on consensus./academy. Just one last slide about EEA and kind of the standards. As NIF mentioned on the chat, the version 2 of the spec is available on GitHub. I think they're already working on version 3, and EA with 400 plus members are currently still meeting weekly and discussing 26 Workmaster different industries and making sure that we all align on the same standards and specifications, so that this is currently up and available and open for new memberships. I think that the roadmap for this is to create EA testnet as well as eventually do a review, and to make sure that specification of your client or tools are met appropriately to the requirements. To summarize the Consensus solution, core aspects. We have demonstrated leadership and capability with proven track record on these delivery of projects, but we've also figured out how to do this quickly, so not just repeating DevOps and those pieces every single project, but really scaling with an agile global delivery team and thinking about production support and how to do end-to-end production support for the Consensus products, those books, but also to the projects that we're supporting. The last 3 slides, and I just want to leave room for questions as well. We can talk about Congo, which is a project that I believe went live today, is working with 15 industry leaders in commodities trade finance. So I believe the first version works with letters of credit, and it's processing financial payments for confirmation of carrier documentation like bill of lading, and so that's just the release of the payments upon the delivery of the goods. So this is obviously starting with a simple use case, but expanding very quickly to cover supply chain and global trade associated to it. And even though it sounds kind of simple, you can develop it, but we had to go through the full go live and to end-to-end testing review with all the institutions in play. And at 27 Workmaster was also built in combination with VAT, which is another product that handles the payments infrastructure. So it's interesting. It has interoperability and connectivity to other platforms as well. Another one to mention is I based out of the Philippines. This is specifically for Interbank Payments and all run by Union Bank, but this is provided for financial inclusion, and I think it's really a good push for different banks to be able to run these satellite hubs at low cost. This is, I believe, going live next year, and they use a mixture of QR codes for remittances. Both of the projects use Kaleido for their base creation of the consortium and the Ethereum networks, and that has really been accelerated from these different products that we have. And finally, I mentioned supply chain very briefly, but Violence is also one of those consensus products that's been around for a while. They've worked with Flexo Smith & Klein for IP. It's really a business process flow association, and I would say that my first introduction to it was when they did a conference and they showed where the tuna was fished, as well as caught up and kind of brought ashore, and so that they had live sushi tasting with the full tracking of the piece of tuna from the source location where it was farmed. And we can answer obviously a lot more questions about these use cases, but I just wanted to hand it back over to Jeff to kind of bring us home, and then we can answer questions. It was delicious and really cool to see exactly where the fish was caught and when. So this is just a visualization slide about 28. Workmaster, how blockchain adoption and usage will grow. On the left, you have an organization which we talked about and its vendors tracking and tracing assets on an enterprise blockchain. It's a standard multi-company usage among parties in a business network, reducing costs around record keeping and inventory real time with it updating and consensus about all the records in the blockchain. The whole network is more aligned by mutualizing these records and data, and it can be real goods being shipped from a warehouse or to a retailer, or digitized assets or tokens or companies and its vendors tracking assets on a blockchain where friction is being removed because trust is inherent in the system. Then in the middle you start to bring in some multiplicity where a blockchain fabric, perhaps even including certain types of clients, giving you larger vetted markets users from perhaps applications as well, and adding on different types of assets, maybe ones that you're using in production as well, and then seeing those assets networks also and being exposed to those as well. And then in this third image on the right, this is where we extrapolate out to the future to a consortium. Goes a little bit like this as well, perhaps an ecosystem starting to link up with other blockchain networks in their ecosystem, and maybe parallel supply chains or simply entities in those chains that interact with your business processes and network as well, kind of able to pull them in or interact them, and as more goods and value travel through and are tracked in these different networks without value being chipped away by third parties, value and time, which are doing manual 29. Workmaster validation, for example, like brokers or notaries who produce in static documents. You'll see that lowering costs will happen and profits will be increased to be able to react to business conditions quicker. You'll have some demised business processes, transparency and share data, and what you also see is that just participation by your business network, by the members in your business network, will be strengthened and aligned and make these partnerships tighter because you're coordinating around the profits that you're each relying on each other for, right, Clemens? So hopefully this was useful. Build with us, I guess, build with us, and feel free to contact us, and as well as any regional consensus representatives. And I think we have a few newsletters that we can share after this with the recording as well as the slides, and I'm just looking through the Q&A now to answer any questions and anything else you want to add, Jeff. If any of the other folks on the panel would like to chime in on anything that was in the questions, feel free. We got some representatives from Solutions as well as the EEA and just from Consensus kind of involvement in the EEA, and then also Pantheon as well. I think we've answered some questions about Quorum and Pantheon. We will send these slides and also a video of the webinar out, so look forward to that, and please get in touch with us. Let's see, I don't see anything specific here just yet. The WFP case you can read about online. Does it? The question was, does it youth kids were reputed in private Ethereum need a login and certificate identity so it accesses a formal UN database firm, the United 30. Workmaster Nation. So I saw some questions about Uport, which is great to see. You can work with them. I think they have contact information on their website. I don't have details about our involvement with the ESA, unfortunately. Now we could talk to the Academy about how I don't think they're issuing any type of official certificates of completion, but obviously there's a history of different courses you take and you can put them on your LinkedIn account, but I don't think we've done any formal education and credentialing space said. I don't think there's a separate spoke or consensus product that does that. How there was a question earlier about using the block changes for immutability within one organization, so kind of the simplest use case for a private blockchain. Do you have any thoughts on how people do that, or seen that in use? I'm just working with a lot of different consortiums and banks. I think I mentioned the internet replacement, and that's really just for building the developer community, but it could also be connecting internal systems using Ethereum as a common protocol and standard, and connecting your own components. Maybe it could be paying for lunch if you're of your particular the point of service or point. If you were to implement that fully, you could probably see some type of amount associated to your identity, so you can be funded a certain amount from your bank account, from even your payroll, and then that could be used to pay for lunches in different areas. Like, it's not too hard to put that together and then have it. 31. Workmaster export some type of report back to different internal systems. So I've seen a lot of really innovative ways to do it, and I think it's pretty interesting. Great. I just noticed that I have muted a couple of our panelists, so apologies for that. We will be doing another one of these panels or these webinars in the new year. We're gonna have a series of these, so this is kind of the intro one, and then we'll get into a couple more maybe complicated topics. We'll definitely Pantheon or Pegasus has been running some webinars about Pantheon. We'll look at some use cases in different industries as well and get into the kind of nitty-gritty of implementations. 32.